Good evening. My name is Tanya Sheehan, and I'm the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Art at Colby College. I am thrilled to welcome you to the third and final event in a public program series titled New Perspectives, Collection and Dialogue, organized by the Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Academy, Andover. The series features leading scholars of American art. Its aims have been to highlight collecting areas in which the Addison can make significant contributions to research and teaching in American art history, to showcase the work of BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, and other historically marginalized artists represented at the Addison, and to critique the collecting practices of museums, including our own. Generous support for the series has been provided by the Lena Lobel Fund and the Alumni Lectureship Fund at Phillips Academy. I'm grateful to the Addison's director, Ali Kemmerer, curator Gordon Wilkins, curatorial fellow Tessa Height, and head of education Jamie Gibbons for everything they've done to make this series possible. And I'm honored to have had the opportunity to collaborate with such a fantastic team and to work with the Addison's extraordinary collection. As a starting point for action to support Indigenous communities, I want to remind us that we are on Native land. Phillips Academy acknowledges its presence on land once inhabited by the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples, as well as the modern-day Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pakanoket, and Nipmuc nations. Phillips Academy honors all Indigenous peoples who are here now, have been here, and will be here in the future. I am thrilled to introduce tonight's speakers, Lauren Kroiz and Tobias Wofford, who will use works from the Addison's permanent collection to reflect on Africa in the American imagination. In recent decades, the Addison has greatly expanded its holdings of artworks by African Americans, including 20th century and contemporary artists who see themselves as part of a global African diaspora. The museum has also historically collected objects by non-Black artists that offer visions of Africa as the site of difference and desire. To paraphrase art historian Carol McGee, they've tended to see Africa as a monolithic entity and primarily a place of nature, not culture, and when cultural, it's exotic. Tonight's conversation will examine how American artists have variously perpetuated and worked against these racialized stereotypes as art and who gets to make it in the US has changed over time. We'll also consider the role that the idea of Africa has played in museums devoted to American art and how it might be imagined differently in the future. Lauren Kroiz is an associate professor in the History of Art department at University of California, Berkeley. She's also the faculty curator of photography, paintings, and works of art on paper at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at Berkeley. Her research and teaching focus on art and modernism in the United States during the 20th century. Tobias Wofford is an associate professor of art history at Virginia Commonwealth University. His research explores the meeting of globalization and identity in the art of the African diaspora since the 1950s, as well as concepts of diversity and multiculturalism in art of the US. Our speakers will begin with presentations of approximately 15 minutes each. Then I will moderate a short discussion between them and open up the conversation to incorporate questions from the audience. Please pose your questions anytime during this event by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will address as many of your questions as time allows. So thank you both for being here tonight. I want to turn things over to Lauren Kroiz, who will give our first presentation.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Let me see if I can share my screen. Just the part of my screen that I intend to share. Slideshow. Do you see 3 images? Okay, I'm Lauren Kroiz. I'm joining you from Berkeley, homelands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And today I picked 3 central images from the Addison's collection, which it was exciting to get to know a little bit. And I focus particularly on the early part of the 20th century. So I show them to you here with some minimal identifying information that I'll talk more about as I go along. So on the left of your screen, I'm used to doing it projected, so I think I'm right. You see a gelatin silver print by Arthur Wesley Dow, a painter, a printmaker, a photographer, and an arts educator who was born in 1857 in Ipswich, Massachusetts. The Addison has a lot of Dow's work, including many studies he did of Ipswich and other photographs and prints. He's a prolific artist. This photograph is identified in the museum's catalog with the information that you see here, Untitled View of Ruins, Egypt, late 19th century, early 20th century. So in the center, you'll see another photograph. This one is a halftone by Alfred Stieglitz that appeared in his journal Camera Work in 1916. Stieglitz was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1867. So he's like roughly the same generation as Dow. He's about 7 years younger. And he was a photographer and also acted as a gallerist in New York, trying to formulate and spread ideas about American modern art through his gallery, which you see in this image, and also his journals. And finally, on the right, there's an image of a Linacut print, African headdress by the artist Hale Woodruff, who was born in 1900 in Cairo, Illinois, which is spelled like Cairo, but pronounced apparently like Caro, a town in southern Illinois that became home to many formerly enslaved African-American people during Reconstruction following the US Civil War. And it might be an interesting site for us to talk about Africa with the name Cairo. So Woodruff is an African-American, or was an African-American artist, painter, printmaker, and educator. And he's about, just to give you a sense of generations, he's about 40 years younger than Dow and Stieglitz, who were both white Americans and traced their families to Europe. So Woodruff finished this block, the block for this print, in Atlanta while he was living there in 1935, but it was printed in a collection of his work in 1996 following his death. So these three artworks give us three different, but I'll argue interrelated ways of the idea of Africa that circulated in the imagination, shaping idea of Africa that circulated in the American imagination, shaping American art and the work of particular artists. So as I start, I also want to center another work from the Addison's collection, this Elizabeth Catlett's print of Phyllis Wheatley, who was born in West Africa, likely somewhere around present-day Gambia or Senegal, around 1753. And when she was around 7 or 8 years old, Wheatley was kidnapped, sold into enslavement, and transported to North America. She eventually became a poet in Boston, and talking about her life and this image could take up far more time than we have. But I wanted to use it to underscore the fact that there are many, many ways to trace Africa and the ideas of the continent in the American imagination. Wheatley, I think, suggests the Africa that lived in the memories and imaginations of early African Americans, enslaved and free. It's a vision that's barely evoked in the art that's traditionally been collected by museums of American art. And it won't be the focus of my remarks today. However, I don't want to suggest that focusing on the early part of the 20th century, I'm somehow beginning at the beginning or offering a comprehensive view of Africa in the American imagination. So returning to Dow, I had a lot of questions about the sketchy information on this photograph. I think that's part of like a scholar's impulse, is to try to figure out, okay, what's going on here? So I started poking around and found Dow's papers, which have been largely digitized by the Archives of American Art. And here I just show you part of their interface, their website. So those papers included information about a trip that Dow took around the world, leaving and returning to Boston in 1903 to 1904. Dow kept a very spotty diary, but his brother, who was a landscape architect, kept really great records of their travels. And they're detailed enough that we can think more precisely about a date and an account for the subject of this photograph. And I think they also help give a sense of what travel abroad might have been like for Americans 120 years ago. So here you can see a spread from those diaries and also Dow's tramway tickets to ride the pyramid line from Cairo. So Dow took this photograph, we can say, in 1904 at what's been called the Ramseyeum of El Qurna in Thebes, which is part of the memorial temple to the pharaoh Ramses II, built in the 13th century BCE and located across the Nile from the modern-day city of Luxor. So Dow's diaries tell us how he got to Egypt from Boston. And I think his itinerary in March and April of 1904 gives us a way to see how an American artist might have experienced Africa in the early part of the 20th century. I made a little map, even though I am not into the digital humanities. So Luxor here is labeled 8. And here are the dates. Dow's travel happened overland, often by rail and by ship. And it gives us a way, I think, to think about what constituted the global in that period. So he left British-controlled India on March 5th, and he traveled across the Red Sea, which the diary noted wasn't actually red, but was blue like every other sea. And after a 5-day trip on the ship, they arrived in Addison, Yemen, a deepwater port controlled by the British. And from there, they traveled by boat through the Suez Canal, which had been finished about 30 years earlier in 1869. Along the way, they learned that someone who they had traveled with had died from plague in India, so that they'd have to likely quarantine if they wanted to disembark in Egypt, which was in the period also controlled by the British. So instead, they decided that they'd sail past Port Said in the upper part of the Suez Canal and through the Mediterranean to land in southern Italy on the Adriatic coast, which took them 2 days. And then they spent a few days in Italy, which didn't seem to be concerned about quarantine. And then they headed back to Egypt, where they spent 2 weeks traveling to major antiquities in March and April of 1904. So that's when Dow took the photograph in the Addison's collection. But even though Dow was seeing Egypt for himself, he's seeing it really highly mediated by prior European travelers. So you can see Dow's framing is almost identical to a photograph taken by the British photographer Francis Frith in this 1857 albumen silver print, which appeared in Frith's extremely popular books about Egypt, Ethiopia, and what's now the Northern Sudan. So on the right in both images, we see the toppled torso of a seated red granite colossal statue of Ramses II. And sometimes the site was also known as the Great Fallen Colossus. When he traveled around the world, Dow was already familiar with Egyptian art and other arts through objects and through images. He worked as an assistant curator of Japanese art at the MFA in Boston. And he based his ideas about modernist composition, which he used as an artist and an educator, on his understanding of Japanese and, to a lesser extent, Egyptian, Aztec, and Oceanic art. From this experience, he developed a theory of composition in an important book that was first published in 1899 and continues to be in print. I show you some images from the first edition of Composition here. So in the book and in his travels, Dow, along with most Americans, understood Egyptian art as an ancient practice that wasn't really connected to the present-day inhabitants of Egypt. In contrast to Dow's travels, Stieglitz took this photograph in his New York Gallery 291. So this is an image that I write about in greater length in my book, Creative Composites, which I should have had here so I could hold up, but I don't. So this is an image so Stieglitz, as we can maybe see in this image, came largely to know African art through European Cubism, which he got to know through the caricaturist and art dealer Marius de Zayas, who arrived in New York from Mexico in 1907. And here's Stieglitz's portrait of de Zayas standing between African works and Picasso's art. So de Zayas traveled to Paris in 1910 and helped arrange Picasso's first exhibit in the US in 1911 at 291, and also a groundbreaking 1914 exhibition of African sculpture also at 291. So he titled the exhibit Statuary in Wood by African Savages, the Root of Modern Art, a title that's quite problematic today for reasons we can also talk more about. So Stieglitz had already had exhibits of European artists inspired by African art, including Picasso and Brancusi, by the time he mounted this exhibition of African art. And the space framed African art primarily in relationship to modernism. DeZayas and Stieglitz's collaborator, Edward Steichen, set the African sculptures, as you see here, against these geometric displays of bright colored paper to try to make the link with a kind of jarring modernism more explicit. DeZayas also wrote essays about African art, arguing that its forms could help authorize ideals beyond those that were traditionally taught at European or American art academies. Positioning the African sculptures as ancient, even though we now think they likely date from the late 19th or early 20th century, DeZayas positioned African art as a form that could return Europeans and Americans to a kind of primordial or savage stimulation of sensation through abstraction. Oops. So the photograph that you see on the left was likely made at the end of 291's season that exhibited both Picasso's work and African sculpture. And Stieglitz is really talking about these as telling the same story through that season of exhibitions. Stieglitz and DeZayas probably rehung the gallery to take the picture on the left, which puts Picasso and African art side by side and also adds a wasp nest. And I argue in my book that we can see this as an attempt to reformulate the artistic canon in Stieglitz's photograph, which has repercussions beyond the formal, pointing to racial relations negotiated in the US between African and European artists and audiences. So in 1915, DeZayas also started a new periodical with Stieglitz, which they called 291. And you see 2 pages from it here. That journal ran for about a year, and the final issue's cover, which you see here, featured work identified as an Ogoye Congo sculpture. And DeZayas also advertised his activities as a dealer of African art at the Modern Gallery, which you see on the right. So like Egyptian art, African art from the south of the Sahara was seen as ancient, and its genius, quote unquote, was not necessarily seen as related to contemporary Africans, but more to European artists like Picasso. African art had been made mobile in new ways by European colonization, and Americans, I think, generally came to understand its forms second or maybe even third hand through French modernisms. So more recently, scholars have begun identifying these artworks and thinking about how they functioned in Africa, not only as inspiration for modernism. And I show you here a screen grab from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 2013 exhibition focused on African art in the New York avant-garde, which tried to identify and trace the reliquary object from 291's cover. This kind of information wasn't readily accessible or prioritized in the United States in the 1910s, or even really in the 1930s when Woodruff created this print. In an interview that's also available online from the Archives of American Art, Woodruff remembered learning about African art while in art school in Indianapolis in the 1920s. And he remembered that he had tried to show his work in the local gallery of the German dealer, Hermann Lieber. And Woodruff recalled that Lieber had given him a book on African sculpture, sort of running after him as he left the gallery and saying, I quote, "I want you to take this little book because it records the great work of your people, African art. You'll learn something about it." And Woodruff then recalled that the book was all in German and he couldn't read it, but he could look at the photographs. And then he went on to study in France in 1927 to 1931, where he also shopped for African art with Alan Locke, an important scholar who Tobias is going to talk more about in a few minutes. And the two visited galleries, they visited shops, they visited the flea market in Paris. But Woodruff remembered that, he says, quote, "Then on seeing the work of Paul Cézanne, I got the connection," end quote. So he says that he admired Cézanne and Picasso because he saw in them a shared sense of form that clarified what he called the structural style of African art. So Woodruff brought some of the African works, he bought them in France, and he brought them with him back to Atlanta, where he created the print that you see here, along with others focused on African-American life in the South, where he taught after leaving Paris. Tobias has a great article, I'm just gonna shout him out, about the links between jet travel, cultural festivals, and Pan-Africanism in the 1960s. And Woodruff did eventually visit Africa at least twice, and he professed a kinship with African artists. But he still remembered that he'd first been introduced to African art in the 1920s through a German book that he couldn't read, and that he understood it through Cézanne and Picasso in Paris. I think I have. So I just wanted to give a very quick tour of 3 examples of the ways Africa and its arts were understood in the American imagination in the early part of the 20th century, often filtered in different ways through Europe, which we can continue to talk about. But now I'll hand it back to Tanya.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate your map and all the shout outs to the Archives of American Art as an employee of the institution. But also I love how you've set up already, basically accounting for why we've been going like this around Africa, right? So because for these artists, Africa could be a physical geographic place, but for many of the artists that you've talked about already, it's more frequently a concept or a motif. It may be a place they've never been to themselves. And we're going to be talking more about the significance of that. So Tobias, do you want to share your screen and take things over from here?
Okay.
Great.
And let me start the PowerPoint. Oops. There we go. Great. Can you see 4 images on this one? Thank you, Tanya, for the invitation in the Addison Gallery, for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. And thank you, Lauren, for such a great and thought-provoking presentation. Hopefully this, you'll see there's of course, lots of dialogue going on. So I think it'll be hopefully a great offering, or a good enough offering. So I'd like to start my engagement with a look at 4 works in the Addison Gallery's collection to tease out a complicated story that I see about exchange, movement, and imagining that connects African-American artists and Africa, and indeed a broader kind of Black Atlantic African diaspora. These works are James Van Der Zee's 1924 photograph of a UNIA march, James Lascelles Wells's Looking Up from 1928, so 2 works from the 1920s, and Romare Bearden's Carolina Memory from 1973, and Max Belcher's Macon Hall House, Fortsville, Liberia, from 1978. So 2 works from the 20s and 2 works from the 70s that I think are in so many interesting ways very much intertwined. What I find so compelling about invoking these images are the ways in which, on the surface, they seem to have little to do with Africa. Yet in profound ways, the grouping reflects a consistent and evolving discourse about historical, political, and aesthetic roles of Africa in the American imaginary. So to begin with James Van Der Zee's image, Van Der Zee is known for his studio photographs and street photographs that he innovatively captured in Harlem throughout the early 20th century. His series of images of UNIA, or the Universal Negro Improvement Association's manifestations and parades in the streets of Harlem, reflect in some ways some of the dynamics of thinking about Africa that was going on in the early 20th century. His series of images are led by the dynamic Jamaican-born leader Marcus Garvey. The UNIA advocated for Pan-African solidarity through Black nationalism that thought of Africa as a locus, a political home to return to. They organized conferences, especially in 1920, that mirrored the Pan-African conferences organized by figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Sylvester Williams in Europe at the time. And they passed manifestos declaring the rights of people of African descent all around the world, and insisting on the end of European colonization of the continent, of the African continent. And so in this way, the works that W.B. Du Bois was doing as far as the Pan-African conferences and the work of the UNIA were also were closely aligned in thinking of anti-colonial efforts and anti-racist efforts as deeply a part of the same coin, different sides of the same coin. The rhetoric of return to Africa was central in the organizing premise of the UNIA, and one that even manifested in the Black Star Line, a shipping company that would carry passengers to and from Africa. That was actually became defunct at the dissolution of the group. While the UNIA was politically connecting to Africa, others were also thinking about the role Africa would play in the lives and aesthetics of African Americans. The very year that Van der Zee photographed the march of the UNIA, the Harlem Renaissance theorist and writer Alan Locke traveled himself to Egypt and Sudan, kind of actually interestingly following in the footsteps of earlier examples we just heard today. Locke developed a set of criticism and theories about the potential influence of African art on African American modernists. Africa in modern visual art has thus often been associated with works such as his 1925 essay, The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts. While race-conscious African-American artists of the 19th century embraced Euro-American artistic styles of the Victorian era, Locke pressed for a cultural revolution through the new Negro Renaissance, or the Harlem Renaissance, noting the popularity of African art among modern primitivists in Europe and the Americas. Locke urged his contemporaries to look to African art traditions in order to create a modernist art that was distinctly African American. To this extent, Locke also wrote about traditional African art, as well as curating exhibitions, including the Blondel Theater Arts Collection exhibition, which traveled around the United States in the later part of the 1920s, and amassing his own collection of African objects. Locke didn't necessarily prescribe what this modernism would look like, but artists like Hale Woodruff and James L. Wells were two examples of artists in dialogue with the concepts Locke was advocating. In fact, Wells professed a great interest in Locke's push for African art. And while not immediately obvious in works like Looking Up, the abstracted forms of West African sculpture are translated into a flat graphic style. An iconic photograph by James L. Allen captured Wells' fascination with African art forms by depicting him holding an elaborate carved cup by a Cuba artist that was actually in Alan Locke's collection, because both Wells and Locke were teaching at Howard University at the time. And thus this discourse about Africa was also very much interestingly centered in Howard, in Washington, D.C., as much as it was in Harlem. This image has been described by scholars such as Yale Biro and Wendy Belter as embodying the interpolation with African art that Locke imagined. Now, not all artists of African descent in the United States approved of this look to ancestral arts, and it was very much framed as ancestral at the time. And I think Lauren provided a really interesting frame that thought of like, these are actually works that are historical or that come from an ancient time, the ancestral legacies, even while many of these works were indeed produced in the contemporary, or at least within the 50 years that they were being collected. So not all artists were approving of this look to ancestral arts. For example, the young artist Romare Bearden critiqued the romantic and essentialist notions of Locke's desire to draw upon African art. In a 1946 essay, Bearden expressed the gist of the major critique against Locke's notion, writing, quote, "It would be highly artificial for the Negro artist to attempt a resurrection of African culture in America. The period between the generations is too great, and whatever creations the Negro has fashioned in this country have been in relation to his American environment. Culture is not a biologically inherited phenomenon." And so here, I forgot that I had this image in here, but just to show the ways in which Wells has also translated this, this technique of modern representation on this kind of wonderful object in the Addison Gallery's collection that is also a book. So there's the meeting of kind of Black advocacy and politics that you see in the work of people like Carter G. Woodson, the very famous African-American historian, thinking about the image of the Negro wage earner. And here the person depicted looks almost as if it's this African sculpture. So this engagement with Africa as African art as a model of self, right? That is also something that Hale Woodruff was very interested in. He thought of African art as very central or kind of upstanding and classical, right? He very much advocated for African art as a classical art. Yet notably, despite his objections with looking to African art, Bearden himself began to incorporate Africa into his work in his 1964 collages, out of which works like Carolina Memory extends. And works such as his 1964 Prevalence of Ritual Baptism, Bearden began to incorporate fractured figures fractured figures and bits and pieces of African masks and other artworks into the composition. His turn to African motifs in 1964 reflects a reconsideration of the connections between African diasporic identities and the continent. One significant development over this period was the increasing knowledge about New World retentions of African tradition. Discourse on African diaspora saw important anthropological studies throughout the 1940s, especially works by Melville Herskovits. Such studies expanded and took on an increasingly art historical bent as the 1950s and 1960s progressed. For example, art historian James Porter wrote a 1958 essay that detailed the scholarship done on artistic survivals of African culture in the Americas, titled Transcultural Affinities of African Art. And what's so interesting about James Porter as an art historian, he was very much early on a deep critic of Locke's embrace of African art. So he thought also he was very much on this anti-essentialist bent. But then by the 60s, he begins to kind of reconsider the position Africa could have within African-American art. Because these retentions of African folk culture were found throughout diasporic folk traditions, including music, as well as religion and folk art, Bearden captured this through a fractured collage style that he continued throughout the rest of his career, which emphasized both the retention of African life and aesthetics, but also the restructuring and fragmentation that such aesthetics experience in the diasporic context. Places such as North Carolina became for him repositories full of memories of African culture. And so he often describes, as just as you see this in Carolina Memory, this idea of the Carolinas, especially as he was born in North Carolina, and kind of considers it a place where these kind of memories, these retentions are happening in African-American culture. This is also why I find Max Belcher's photographs so compelling, and I never was unaware of them before I began looking through the Addison Gallery's collections. His works depicting residents in buildings of Liberia reflect a back and forth between Africa and the United States as an ongoing exchange begun in the 19th century through the establishment of colonies in Liberia by organizations such as the American Colonization Society, where free and formerly enslaved Black Americans, and here the terms African and African Americans and Black Americans become quite interestingly fraught, right? Where these freed Americans were able to return or at least migrate to Africa. Belcher's connection to Africa himself began in 1954 when he was 10 years old, and his father, who had emigrated to Liberia and became a naturalized citizen of Liberia, brought him and his wife and his children there. Belcher's father was also connected to the independence era figures such as Kwame Nkrumah, who worked to usher post-colonial Africa through the 1960s and 1970s. And so Belcher spent his time in the US, in Liberia, French Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And his photography in the 1970s, Liberia, chart the historical settler architecture erected by Black American immigrants in the traditional style of the Southern United States. These images were published in Belcher's book, a photo book, A Land and Life Remembered, America, Liberian Folk Architecture. And this interesting architecture kind of mirrors other returnee architecture that you see from the later part of the 19th century. Perhaps more famous examples could be seen in Nigeria and the kind of Afro-Brazilian architecture in Lagos. So juxtaposed against Bearden's collage, where the Carolinas exist as a site of memory and cultural mixing, one sees the lines between Africa and America blur as each community looks back across the Atlantic and the waves of movement and migration bring together Africa as a site of imagination. So with that, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Tobias. That was a really compelling set of comparisons. I want to invite everybody to begin putting their questions in the Q&A, and we will address them in the next 20 minutes. I want to start, though, by asking the two of you if you would like to engage in conversation with one another based on what you just saw. And then from there, I have some questions that might get us even into the contemporary as well. So if I'd open it up to both of you first.
What do you think, Tobias?
I mean, I'd be interested to have a little conversation, I think, about what I find so fascinating is the way, especially we're looking at these modernists, kind of white American modernists or Euro-American modernists and African-American modernists. And the forms they're producing are so similar. And in fact, they're very much in dialogue with one another. And yet I wonder, yet we can interpret them in such different ways, like how they work for each of these groups and audiences is so different, the makers and the audiences, I mean. And so I'd be curious to hear how you think through that, Lauren, especially as a scholar, because I don't know, it's interesting too, because there's a lot of, even the looking at African artworks, right, involves a lot of misinterpretation, and the slide of the object, right, that frees itself from its original production, and whether we can think about that now as 21st century viewers looking at modernist works from the early 20th century,
Yeah, and I think trying to think through who it serves and who it served when. I think especially like I am highly conscious that I haven't ever really studied African art. So I tend to want to talk about everything as like, oh, it's a mask. But I'm like, actually, no, it's a part of a reliquary that was somebody's, like, belonged to someone, and it like held all the things that were important to their family. And so trying to think about what are the stakes of not knowing, or like how we think about these different disciplines. I was trained as a quote unquote Americanist and a quote unquote modernist. And in that canon, you don't necessarily have to know what African forms look like. But of course, then it's super important if you're going to try to do work try to do a different version of the work that Stieglitz was doing, or try to even understand the kinds of silences that are created in this work, just like constantly in the African work, constantly changing hands and nobody really understanding what they're looking at, except that it's an inspiration for Picasso and it could be an inspiration to them. It's also, I think, hard for me now, because even if you sort of begin to understand that work, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Met should be doing that work, or like sort of thinking through what museums should be doing and what kinds of different museums should be doing. Like that is probably like, is that piece of a reliquary the most important because Dizea sold it to Stieglitz, or does it have like a million other stories it could tell? So I think I don't have a really good answer, but I think it is like a fascinating and super problematic nexus to think about people looking at similar things and often looking at them together, but like drawing these radically different, it's not even like a sense of ownership, but like a different kind of sense of connection, or a different kind of sense of what it could open. Like I was thinking, if you had a German dealer now running down the street after someone who was African American to give them this book, it would be like, that would be so weird. But I think it's really done out of a spirit of like, I think it's done out of a spirit of like wanting to support a kind of expression, and wanting to make knowledge accessible, but to think about how that might play out for different artists. I'm like, it's not really resolved for me either. I don't know. Do you have thoughts?
I mean, I find that story for Woodruff to be so interesting. Like you say, it is kind of a weird thing. Like, oh, this is supposed to be my ancestors or whatever, right? Yet it is so important for him, and it really frames the way he thinks about his own making, and he doesn't understand the work, but he realizes it's important. He doesn't understand, the German, it's I think Carl Einstein's Afrikanische Plastik, which my German or whatever is horrible. But what's also interesting, it makes me think of a book that maybe came out in 2019 by Joshua Cohen, that is about it's called, I think, I'm just going to slaughter it, but the Black Renaissance. And it's one of the arguments is that actually some of the African works that Picasso was collecting was made for an international art market. Like the African makers were already cognizant that there were Europeans who wanted to buy their works, right? So they're being exported as objects for an art market, right? And to think of, in that context, the ways in which the African artwork could be, and the African artist who is, erased from this purposefully, but is actually a conscious, like, participant in that discourse. Not true of all of the works, right? And they just get all jumbled all together, so you can't really separate them all. Or it takes a kind of archaeological kind of unpacking to really figure out like what came from where and when. But that kind of work some people are actually doing, and it's quite fascinating, right? To see who is getting what and why, right? And it's interesting to think about the collections, because especially in the early 20th century, Locke is drawing on, and these artists are drawing on the same stuff that the European modernists are drawing on. But their intentions are quite different. And I find that fascinating for us from this position in the 21st century. And I think, the time difference is almost similar, right? To think about how modernism functions for contemporary artists, as a wellspring of weird messed upness, but also like potential. Yeah, it's really messy. And then to think of, for me, what I find so interesting about the Max Belcher is like, these are African Americans returning again in quotes, right, to Africa, bringing forms that are then going to be influencing African artists and architects there that will eventually perhaps come back, right? And so there's actually probably a longer and deeper story of exchange than we think of as originating in the colonial moment, right?
Yeah, because he goes on, he also does a series about the American South, right? So I think there's something that's like, I'm thinking about Woodruff and the African headdress, but it's part of a portfolio that also has like another print entitled Relics, which seems to be about the American South. It's like a donkey or a mule. And so thinking through like, there's a sort of a slippage or a trying to conjure also, like might have even like a fantasy of Atlanta or like not being from the South but returning to the American South too. Yeah, there's a lot of these interesting slippages or like continuities, I guess. Yeah.
Well, both of you have talked about the responsibility that historians of American art and museums devoted to American art have to present this work with nuance, right? So if you have artists, Black and white, that are looking at the same kinds of objects from Africa and are engaging in, on the surface of things, what looks like a similar kind of reduction to form or instrumentalization of object to modernist art purposes, how do you present those two ways of engaging with Africa as not the same, right? How do you do that work? How do you convey that to audiences? So can we talk about that a little bit here? Or do you want to tease out the similarities and then?
I mean, so I guess when I was thinking about Woodruff and thinking about the way that he talks about knowing African art through Paris in some ways, I think there is a claim that it's not biological. It's not like he just woke up and was like, oh yeah, I'm an African artist. And he has this really interesting quote from the 60s that I couldn't figure out a way to fit in. But he says, in 68, there are many artists, and this is kind of what Tobias talked about too, and other people today who believe we have no part of Africa's history. And he says, I look at the African artist certainly as one of my ancestors, regardless of how we feel about each other today. So there's a sort of a a part of, but different than. And so trying to figure out, it's totally complicated, and it has been probably from the beginning, like thinking about what Bearden's saying, Tobias, like there's no one, I guess, like for me, the category of white or African American, that's not enough either. There's like sort of not enough complexity there. Of course, it's like a base level, but at the same time, there's so many other ways that people want to understand what they're doing and who they are and who they want to be and who people who look like them, what kinds of work they can make. So I don't know, Tobias, you might have a better, more thought through.
No, I think it's an interesting point, right? That even, I don't know, I find that some of Woodruff's discussion of African art, even, when he's going to Africa in the 60s, and he's going kind of as an advisor for the US, right? He's being sent by the USIA and that sort of thing. And then he comes back and he's like, they really need to modernize their art program, like they're stuck in the past, kind of in a way that is also maybe a little bit problematic, right? And what I think would be really interesting for museums to begin to try to do is to not frame things as like, this is the source of inspiration and this is the modern work, right? But to think of them as existing together in a really weird conversation that is also fraught through with power, right? With the issue of race in the United States, or the issue of race globally, right? And colonization, and to imbue those stories, you kind of have to bring as many of the different participants in that story and their perspectives into it. Like, how to do that in a museum space is hard because, you have to convince people to read the labels, to like really think about those things in conversation, which is, and think about it in a way that we have against a way that we have already been trained to think about,
Right.
I think that kind of work is hard to do. But that said, like many audiences, when I think about like Black audiences today, like not everyone has the same diasporic story, not in the United States anymore, right? And so that also adds layers of complication that I find really useful and fruitful, right? To think and rethink like the histories that, of the 20th century in particular. That's what I'm interested in. But, and they were happening already in the 20th century, right? As Belcher and even Locke show. I had an image of Haile Selassie. There's a great image of Haile Selassie in the Addison collection, and Hale Woodruff in that first trip met Haile Selassie before he was when he was the Rastafari, not before he was the emperor, right? And so there's this really interesting exchange with Ethiopia, also centered in Howard, that I find really, really interesting. So there's all this exchange going on, and Africa's a dynamic participant, as opposed to like a kind of silent partner, which we've been critiquing for a long time, but it's still hard to get away from that dynamic.
Well, we have a question from the audience. We've been talking so far about the training of art historians, but there's a question from the audience about the training of artists. And it talks about, it's asking you to talk about, I should say, the relationship between the history of museums with art schools like the MFA Boston that began expanding, requiring sketching of Greek and Roman sculpture to include African and Asian sculpture, when those same museums started to collect African art in the early 20th century. I don't know if either of you have done any work around that subject, but that is a very interesting one. No,
I haven't done any work around that subject. I can say though that Dow is so invested in arts education, and it was interesting putting this together because I don't tend to think of him as like a primitivist in the same way that we think of Stieglitz as a primitivist, but really trying to think about the way that he's he's doing something similar in the sense that he's trying to come up with some new way to understand art and modern art by looking to other cultures and saying, well, they don't do it the way we do it, they do it this other way. And so for him, this idea of the notan, which is mostly drawn out of Japanese art, but he's also interested in these kind of repetitive patterns, and clearly then knowing those through the collection at the MFA, which is assembled like early, is assembled before he goes on his trip around the world. So I think in some ways, I think we can see it as like diversifying kind of a urge to like say, yes, we're going to draw everything from around the world and we'll learn. What exactly we'll learn though is, I guess, not always articulated. So that might be something to continue to think about. What are our intentions when we expand the canon of what we're going to use to teach students, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Tobias, you brought us into the 1970s. I'm wondering if we can bring this conversation further forward into the last few decades and think about how African-American artists in particular, how their representations of Africa have changed, continue to change since the 70s. At the risk of problematically generalizing, what trends are you seeing in contemporary African-American art?
Well, I definitely, it's hard to say trends.
Yeah.
I feel like one thing, there's a little bit of freedom almost from the question of, well, it's both I think it's more of a freedom from the question of authenticity that that really was something that Bearden was really worried about, right? He's like, well, if I incorporate African art into these works, it won't be, like authentically an expression of myself, because, like my historical experience and the Black experience in the United States has erased, the connection. And I feel like a lot of, and though I wouldn't say that the discourse around authenticity is not there in terms of the Black Atlantic, but there's such a broad acceptance of the flow of culture in Black global culture and global art, that people are just kind of feel comfortable to pull a kind of Black Panther moment, like that's very much accepted in a way that even in the 80s and 90s, there were certain forms that were, I think iconically diasporic. You can do some Congo things because Robert Farris Thompson said you can, that kind of thing. And now I think it's even more kind of just global Black culture that people are just drawing from, and it meshes in for African-American artists. And I think that that's kind of cool and great and interesting, weird too. And I don't know, I'm wrapping my head around it, but I find it really kind of exciting, right? And you also see stories that are about like, and I'm going out of like art and with a capital A or whatever, but like the Woman King and stories that are also historical African stories that I think maybe begin to rebalance what the roots of American culture are. And I think this is kind of good for everyone in a way, because I think there will be more possibility for artists of many different backgrounds to think about like how Africa is working in their lives and cultural backgrounds, Lauren, what do you think?
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm qualified to say, but I think that I appreciate everything that you said, Tobias. I was thinking like that maybe we see folks working through a kind of a personal inheritance with a more specificity. So I really like in the Addison's collection, there's a piece by Andrea Chung from 2020 that's really interesting and thinking about a kind of specificity of a Caribbean experience that might be in relationship with Africa, but different than, or sort of how complex in that way, and trying to think about traditional forms without really looking traditional. So like using bark cloth or using beading, but not to create a sort of facsimile or something that might be like, I think you said, like authentic. I'm also thinking like with Sadie Barnett's piece that's in the Addison too, her work with her dad's work in the Black Panther movement is sort of thinks almost more about, or as much about, a specific family story as it does about like a broad category of Africa. So I think that's work that's exciting and interesting. And folks like Raymond Saunders in the 90s, sort of looking almost more to the Pacific, to Japan, because he's out on the West Coast and sort of thinking through what that experience might look like, and not to have to look at African art, but to have a sort of other possibilities is another kind of interesting way to think about shaking up that idea of the sort of authenticity, or whether you're looking at one sort of generalizable Africa. Yeah.
Right. Well, there's so much more we could say about this. I'm wondering if, by way of closing tonight and the series, you might leave each of you leave us with a question that you think we really should be asking in the field about Africa and American art. What are we not talking about, and what should we be talking about when it comes to Africa and American art? No pressure. You're up.
I mean, I guess I can think about, so for me, the question is, I guess, if we're thinking about it as a field, maybe what knowledge do we feel like folks have to have, or how are we going to assemble this knowledge together? Because I think, like Tobias, I think of you as someone who like is sort of contemporary and African diaspora, and I think of myself as like arts of the United States, modern. And so how do those divides serve us or not serve us? And how much, I think it's hard because graduate students will also then want to feel like they need to know everything to be able to do anything. And then that also kind of stops the work. So I think trying to figure out I don't want to say we have to redraw the boundaries of our fields, but how do we maybe think intentionally about the boundaries of our fields and what kinds of knowledge they produce and prohibit? So what does it mean to sort of either respect them, shake them? I'm not sure what kinds of knowledge haven't we been able to acquire, and how might we go about doing that in a way that's like not exploitive and doesn't not just reproduce the problems of the past. Yeah, it's utopian. I don't know.
I mean, I think that's a great response. I would even also, some of the ideas of writing American art in the United States, right? Or writing about like Africa, the dialogue between Africa and American art, like it would be cool to have some African scholars doing that. You know what I mean? And it is interesting when you think of like the collections of, in American museums, right? How functional they've been for artists. I think one of the questions is about like, sketching, using these objects. And I recall like meeting a young scholar from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he was like, oh, I'd never seen a Congoan Kisi until I was in the United States, right? Because there aren't anymore in, at least in his experience in the DRC, right? So what would it look like to decenter that question by inviting other scholars, internationally, to make it not in a way to make an imperialize, to get people to colonize other places, but rather to invite other perspectives on that story. I think that would be really interesting. I don't know how to do it, but and that's not really a question either, but what would that look like, I guess, is
What would that look like, right?
Yeah.
How
What
do
would
we
it
do
look
it?
like? Yeah, if we weren't the ones
Exactly.
doing it. Yeah.
Right. Well, we could continue for a very long time, but we are at 7:05, so I'm going to close for tonight. But thank you both so much for being here and sharing your questions and your scholarship. And I'm a great admirer of both of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you for being here.